Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Welcome, and thank you for attending this panel discussion about the unfinished work of children's rights in the United States. I am Marta Tienda, a sociologist and demographer from Princeton University and president of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. The reason we're gathered today begins and ends with Marian Wright Edelman, an unparalleled champion of children's rights in the United States, who today will receive the 2022 Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize in Social Science and Public Policy. I have two responsibilities this afternoon. First, to tell you about the prize and bestow it to Mrs. Edelman, and then to introduce you to the panel. First, the prize. Each year, the American Academy of Political and Social Science awards the Moynihan Prize in Social Science and Public Policy to someone who contributes to carrying forward the sizable legacy of the late Senator Moynihan, who was both an accomplished social scientist and a gifted public servant. The prize recognizes individuals who champion the use of informed judgment to advance the public good. There is no doubt that Mrs. Edelman's judgment is and always was deeply informed. She's a voracious consumer of academic work on child and family well-being with a remarkable ability to translate research evidence for use in public policy making. She has advanced and influenced generations of policymakers here in Washington, D.C., and across the nation, always applying the latest scholarship to her work as an advocate and an organizer. But beyond the use of informed judgment, Mrs. Edelman's towering influence has been uniquely transformative in modern America over the last century. She stands without peer as a stalwart and preeminent voice, putting and keeping health and well-being of all children on policy, legislative, and research agendas. What is more, Mrs. Edelman has inspired countless people to public service and academic careers devoted to improving children's fortunes. Mrs. Edelman, I'm going to keep my introduction of you short today, because much will be said of you over the course of the next hour by our distinguished panelists, each of whom you influenced. And rather than speaking at great length about your outsized influence over our nation's political leadership, about your indelible imprints on domestic and civil rights legislation, or about the millions of children whose life chances were brightened because of your unfaltering dedication to their cause over your remarkable career, I have the pleasure of conveying gratitude by presenting you the 2022 Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize on behalf of the Board of Directors of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Please join me at the podium to receive your award. Now on to my second responsibility. We want to spend as much time as possible with our panel today, so I'll forego the lengthy introductions, but you may come to the podium, please. I'll forego lengthy introductions, as just slightly more generous bio statements about each are in the printed program. I would like to briefly acquaint you with them as they get settled. Our moderator is Bob Greenstein, another highly influential figure in policy analysis and service, and previous Moynihan Prize awardee. He is the founder and president emeritus of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and currently senior visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. We are in his debt for his role in shaping today's program. He's joined by three panelists today: Richard Buery, currently president and CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation in New York City. Richard has dedicated his professional life through his work in local government, among philanthropies, and as leaders of community benefit programs to serving underprivileged children and adults. Lee Shore is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Her work instantiates the mission of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, using cutting-edge academic research and field experience to produce and improve the effectiveness of social policy. And Dutta-Gupta, who is Director and CEO of the Center for Law and Social Policy, Indy devoted his career to improving services to poor and disadvantaged Americans by ensuring the best possible research influences both policy and the activity of advocacy organizations. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in this celebration of Marian Wright Edelman's illustrious career. I cede the podium to our moderator, Bob Greenstein.
Thank you very much, Marta. My fellow panel members, we have a really daunting task. Trying to do justice to the extraordinary contributions of Marian Wright Edelman over a period of more than 50 years in a one-hour panel. Most of us have probably never met, throughout the course of our lifetimes, anyone as impactful, as consequential, and as inspirational as Marian all at the same time. So, panel members, let's get started. I'd like to ask each of you first to just take a few minutes and discuss, we can't possibly cover all of them, but some of what you think of as Marian's most important contributions. And Lee, let's start with you.
Well, I have been blessed to know Marian for a very long time. And I want to cite a few examples from her early life, from her earliest days as an advocate, to illustrate the powerful influence that she has had on our nation's policies and politics. She emerged from Spelman and from Yale Law School to become the first African-American woman admitted to the Mississippi bar. That allowed her to defend activists who came to Mississippi for the Freedom Summer of 1964. In 1965, she helped establish, right in Mississippi, one of the most grassroots-based Head Start programs in the country, which not only enhanced a lot of small children's lives, but also led to their parents getting jobs outside the plantation structure. Second, and perhaps most notably for that early period, her work in Mississippi ultimately resulted in a radical and permanent change in how this country dealt with hunger. It was in April 1967 when Marian had persuaded Senators Kennedy and Joseph Clark to visit Mississippi so they might better understand the state's most urgent needs. As they toured the state, the senators encountered little children surrounded by roaches and rats, and so malnourished that they couldn't respond to the adults who were trying to play with them. In the course of observing all of this, Senator Kennedy turned to his administrative assistant, Peter Edelman, and said, "I've been to third world countries, but I've never seen anything like this." There are many stories of how affected Senator Kennedy was by that trip, but I have my own. My husband, Dan Shore, who was with CBS at the time, persuaded his bosses to let him cover the Kennedy trip to Mississippi. Because these were the olden days, I went to meet my husband at the airport, even got to go to the gate, as he and Robert Kennedy were in deep conversation as they got off. And the three of us walked to the car that was waiting for Senator Kennedy. In that walk, I still, after all this time, can't forget how deeply moved Senator Kennedy was by his experience. He couldn't stop talking about the hungry children. In his biography of Kennedy, Evan Thomas wrote that when Kennedy came home that evening, he walked in on his family having dinner, highly agitated, and in the words of his daughter Kathleen, ashen-faced. He described the children he had observed covered with sores, with their little tummies sticking out because they had no food. The following morning, Kennedy and Edelman met with the Secretary of Agriculture, Orville Freeman. I hope you recognize this story, Peter. If necessary, you can correct it.
You're doing well.
They angrily criticized the Agriculture Department for trying to charge hungry families for food stamps even though they had no money. To Freeman's insistence that there isn't anyone in America who has no income, Kennedy replied, "I'll tell you what, I'll send Peter here back down there with some of your people. Will you agree that you'll change the regulations if your people are convinced that there really are people in Mississippi who have no income?" Freeman agreed. Marian arranged a trip that was the beginning of a massive change in how food stamps were distributed in America and how prominent the issue of hunger became. It was also the beginning of Robert Kennedy making child poverty central to his politics for the rest of his life. Another landmark from that era is the little-known fact that it was Marian who suggested to Martin Luther King the Poor People's Campaign. She helped to sustain it after King was assassinated and became its general counsel. Marian moved to Washington in 1968. I still remember the first time I met her. She was holding a living room of Washingtonians spellbound as she talked about what needed to be done. She explained that if we want a just society, we have to start with children. Drawing on what we know about politics as well as what we know about child development, she made clear that to change the lives of those who have too long been left behind requires that we change how we care for our children's health, their education, and their families. None of us who heard her that evening were surprised when 5 years later she started the Children's Defense Fund.
Andy?
That's a lot to follow.
Well, let me start at a higher level. I think one of the things in my career that has stood out about Marian's impact is how she demonstrated that research can matter, that research can move people, that you can document problems in ways that compel people with power, as Lee described, to act. And how she applied her creativity to developing viable solutions that she then helped realize. There was no part of this sort of process of change that Marian was not a part of. And that is quite remarkable and has certainly always inspired me. But I also want to pick up on something Lee said about the importance of supporting children as it relates to justice. For me, Marian also demonstrated that achieving racial equity depended on supporting children and ensuring decent jobs for their caregivers. So even the structure of Head Start today, which was affected and influenced by Marian's work, is quite relevant for the challenges we're facing. When we think about states that reject policies and programs that would improve racial equity, precisely the same challenges that we were facing then. And when we think about the connection between supporting children and their caregivers in debates like the child tax credit and others that we can talk more about. But Marian also showed to me that education was not just about academic achievement. It is about that. But it was about raising citizens and leaders. And that's all too easily forgotten. I think this applied to children as students, but this also applied to adults as parents who could become deeply engaged in their children's education and then in the broader community. And I think the final thing I would just note that I think Marta indicated earlier, but I found this with Peter and Marian both. Throughout my career, I constantly run into people who say they do what they do because of Marian. And that means that her effects will multiply really into perpetuity. And that is quite a legacy. When you really think about as much of a giant as Marian is, the effects of her life are so much greater because of the impact she had on inspiring others.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Marta. Thank you, everyone, for having me here, for having us here. So, Robert, as you said, it's almost an impossible question to answer for the reasons that you all both described. You know, when I think about your legacy and your impact, sort of going through with some friends, just sort of thinking through all the policies of the last 50 years that we think about when we think about the fight for children. Every alphabet soup, from ESSA to the IDEA to the child tax credit, all these things. I mean, there is literally no significant piece of public policy directed towards the well-being of children and families that does not have the fingerprint of the Children's Defense Fund on it. And so it's almost a fool's errand to try to think through at an individual level what is the impact, because literally my entire life is everything. And so when trying to think about how I would think about the question, part of it is just what you said, Indy. I mean, and historians here will correct me if I'm wrong, but at least from my perspective, it seems like the entire discipline of evidence-informed advocacy, evidence put to work to drive policies to make America a more just place for its most vulnerable people, its children, is a discipline that you created. It is a discipline that is now utilized in every part of the world. So in some ways, I think, you know, the legacy is not about any particular program, as wonderful and as amazing as some of those programs are. It is in the fact that we would approach this work in this way. To be parochial about it, you know, I lead this foundation in New York. And I can tell you that my foundation would not exist, certainly would not exist in the way that it does without Mrs. Edelman's leadership, who joined the board at the beginning, and that was critical. This is an organization that was funded by a group of hedge fund managers who don't necessarily have a lot of credibility when it comes to the fight against poverty or a lot of experience. So to have you there, I know this because as I coming here today, talking to some of our board members and some of our founders about your impact. A couple of things they said is, one, of course, the credibility. It allowed them to engage with community organizations and government in New York in a particular way because Marian Wright Edelman was involved. All of a sudden, people take you seriously. But our entire approach to the work, which is the idea that it is not enough to mean well, that if we are serious about making this a more just country, we have to be sure that we are advancing policies that actually have impact. That is deep in the bones and the DNA of our organization, and that's because that's what you taught us. So one quick story, and then just I was talking to one of our founders, David Saltzman, who led Robin Hood for almost 30 years. And I was like, well, tell me a story. Just tell me a story that I can share. And the story he said that it was Martin Luther King Day, and as a good CEO, he had, the staff was off. He'd given the staff off the day. It was a holiday. And Mrs. Edelman called him in the office and couldn't get him, and then called him at home and said, I've been trying to reach you. And he said, oh, well, we're off today. And he said that she paused, that you paused, and you said to him, Martin would want you to be working today. And he talked about how horrible it feels to be chastised. That sentence kind of broke his heart. That sentence sort of broke his heart. But maybe part of what I sort of take from that story, and I will say it personally for me, everybody here would say that I would certainly say that I do this work. Before I knew you, I loved you from the time I found out who you were in college, when I was in college. And it is I guess I would just describe it as the moral voice for those who lack a political voice. It's a voice that I think many a day would make me get out of bed when I didn't feel like getting out of bed, because I know that there are people who need us, and I know that you would want us, you would want me to be doing the work. So, thank you.
If I could add a few thoughts before we go to the next question. When Marian founded the Children's Defense Fund, she was really a trailblazer in doing that. CDF was unlike any nonprofit any of us had seen before. Here was a new organization that blended expert, in-depth data analysis, deep policy and program analysis, with clear-eyed vision, moral authority, and extremely effective advocacy involving both highly skilled work directly on Capitol Hill and with White Houses, and work to mobilize people, not just in DC, but all across the country. And the results were stunning. Just to give one example, you know, when the 1980s started, millions and millions of children were uninsured, and you generally had to be on cash welfare assistance to be eligible for Medicaid. Ronald Reagan got a Medicaid cut through in 1981. Then enter Marian and CDF. By '84, the Reagan cut had expired, and led and inspired by Marian and CDF, a transformation of Medicaid for children began, working hand in glove with people like Henry Waxman and Ted Kennedy. Marian and her team expanded Medicaid, first to cover all poor children, then to start covering near poor children, modest income children, expansion of Medicaid upon expansion of Medicaid under Republican and Democratic presidents alike, followed by the creation and expansion of CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Millions and millions of children gained coverage as a result. And I just want to mention one other thing that comes to my mind. Those amazing books that Marian led CDF to put out every year with the bold green covers and a chapter on what should we do for children on income, on food assistance, on health care, on area after area. For so many of us, those books, when they came out each year, they were both a Bible and a roadmap. And they were a Bible and a roadmap not only for other people doing advocacy, but increasingly for many policymakers at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue as well. The impact was profound. Panel, moving along, looking at where the nation was in supporting children when Marian began work on these issues in the 1960s, and where the nation is today. What do you see in terms of the progress that's been made, but also the unfinished business that remains?
I just want to insert, Bob, that I'm glad you're not performing only a ceremonial function here, but have a lot of content to offer to us as well. A perfect example of the progress that has been made and the unfinished business, I think, is in the brief life of the expanded child tax credit that was enacted in March of last year and came to an end at the end of last year. That legislation, as most of you know, provided a monthly child allowance to families to which there were no strings attached. It was just money. It could be used for childcare, food, clothes, for anything. It treated parents, even poor parents, as the experts on their family's finances. A quite radical idea in American social policy. It significantly increased the chances that millions more children would grow up healthy, well-educated, and prepared for a productive adulthood. Senator Cory Booker called it the most transformative policy coming out of Washington since the days of FDR. Jason DeParle, who covers poverty for the New York Times, described it as a big deal philosophically because it really shifts the way government thinks about what children need and what the government's responsibility is in providing it. So what caused this shift in thinking? How to explain that the US government is saying there is a level beneath which no child in this country should fall. It took the focused research of the National Academy of Sciences, a handful of university research centers, which mobilized and brought to public attention, by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro with a few colleagues, but also with the decades of advocacy spearheaded by Marian and the Children's Defense Fund. Together, they were able to show that we know how to end poverty. Then how do you explain that the EITC lasted only 6 months, allowing nearly 10 million children to suddenly plunge back below the poverty line? How did it happen that such a major triumph was allowed to slip through our fingers? What will it take to turn that short-lived victory to long-term public policy? I think we're going to address that issue with your next question, so I'll leave it there. Just to register, we have made extraordinary progress under Marian's leadership and that of her colleagues, but it didn't last, and we have to figure out why.
Sure, we can mix up the order. Yeah. Well, I think, Lee, you started our conversation today discussing Marian's background as a civil rights lawyer. As a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi, a state notoriously resistant to civil rights. In some ways, when I think about progress in the fight against child poverty, I think about it similarly to the way I think about the fight for racial justice in America, which is the idea that it is a cyclical journey, that we make progress as a country in the fight for racial justice, and it's the nature of our country for entrenched forces to resist that fight. So you take steps forward and you take steps back, and I think this fight is similar, and probably similar because of our racism, right? Because I think in some level, we as a country fight advances in child poverty for fear that black and brown children will somehow benefit from them. So again, it's undeniable that our progress as a country, when you talk about the visit, Senator Kennedy's famous visit, that we're in a different country. Since the war on poverty, I think poverty has declined 50%, but it remains the case that millions of Americans live in or near poverty. 11 million children live in poverty. A lot of those children are in New York, where my work is, where 1 in 5 children live in poverty, where I think 3/4 of children live near poverty, live within 200% of the poverty line. And so I guess what I would really say is, well, a few things. One is, as you were just saying, Lee, one powerful advance is that we have had, even over the last 2 years, incontrovertible evidence that policy matters, that the idea of fighting poverty and ending poverty is not fanciful. Like we have seen that policies can advance that. And part of what I love about the Children's Defense Fund is thinking about the cyclical nature of the fight. So often, it's a fight that is one that you spend time playing defense. You are trying to protect against prior gains. In New York, we just, under CDF New York leadership and other organizations, fought to finally raise the age of criminal liability in New York. It's a constant fight to defend those advances. But part of what I love about the work is that CDF doesn't only play defense, even when that might be the smart thing to do. I'm just thinking about, again, my work is in New York, so I tend to think about what's happening in New York. New York State in the last budget just made a historic investment in childcare, a $7 billion investment to expand eligibility for childcare by increasing income limits. Children's Defense Fund was a leader in that fight in New York, something that seemed impossible, when that advocacy began. New York State also just passed a law to commit to, called the Child Poverty Reduction Act, committing to reduce child poverty by 50% in New York State. Again, easy to have the charge, the commission, the devil is in actually developing the policies and putting them to work. But I guess what I would say about where we are, deep advancements, constant opposition, but we don't give up. And again, we are, in part because of your leadership, live in a world where at least we know we're not arguing about whether it's possible, we're arguing about whether we're going to do it. And fundamentally, I think that is a victory, that is the advance.
And I'll just add that I think we've clearly made the progress that's been described here, and in a thematic way, I feel that we have a deeper understanding of how economic security and opportunity are intertwined, how they support each other intergenerationally. And I think that we have, in particular, really, because of a lot of the work that Marian and others have done over those decades, we have had a lot of opportunity to test out solutions, to analyze and understand them. So in many ways, the research is far out ahead of what our policies reflect today. But I do want to touch on Bob's point about the unfinished business, because I think there's a lot there where we can catch up to our understanding. And I think that there are a number of areas where I would suggest, even building off of Marian's legacy, we might want to focus now. One is racial segregation, residentially, educationally, and the like, and certainly racial disparities more generally, but I think that is an area where in some cases we've gone backwards. And I think we need to draw more attention to solutions for that, and how to win those solutions. Another, I think, is related to what Lee was saying. I think people have come to appreciate the role of some basic income, some floor, but I think we're seeing all the experiments throughout the country, cities, counties, piloting these efforts. And of course, we piloted an effort at the national level with the enhanced child tax credit, but how, I think that is essential when I think about the unfinished business that remains, ensuring that for kids. But one other thing that, whenever I think about racial equity and I think about even the structure of the Head Start program, is how we can deal with the flexibility and the current, frankly, court jurisprudence around federalism, and states having the options to reject policies that would reduce racial equity, and how we can work around that if that's what we have to do. And we'll talk more about other things we might do going forward. But that state flexibility is a real challenge. I think about Mississippi. Today, my colleague, who I think is still here, Elizabeth Lauer-Bass, just testified before the Mississippi state legislature on their TANF program. And you think about how a handful out of 100 children experiencing poverty in Mississippi get cash assistance under that program, a program that, at least in part, is supposed to serve that purpose. And we have a long way to go, and we have to think about structures and systems to get there. The final thing I would just note is, again, where I think we came close, and maybe there will be another bite at the apple. I believe there will be more bites at the apple on the child tax credit, but is caregiving more generally and how we value caregiving. America's caregiving policies are completely out of line with what a modern economy, a wealthy nation requires, can afford, and in many ways, I think, should be seen as investments when we think about the question of affording it. But that is an area where we have not made the progress that I certainly would have hoped for.
Thank you. A quick note on the progress front. I was looking the other day at some very interesting data from data analysis from the data team at my old organization, the Center on Budget. And it showed that in 1970, federal programs and policies, programs, taxes, all of it, lifted out of poverty on net no children who would otherwise be poor. Yes, there were some social programs that lifted some children above the poverty line, but our tax policies actually taxed some children into poverty, and the net was a wash. By 2017, the last year for which these data are available, federal programs and policies lifted out of poverty 46% of the children who would otherwise be poor. We have a considerable way still to go. The other 54% remain poor. But going from 0 to 46% is major progress, and the data show very clearly that it's overwhelmingly the result of the expansion, step by step by step, over several decades, of a number of social programs. Is there anyone in the room who doubts that had it not been for Marian, those expansions would not have been as robust as they were, and millions more children today would still be in poverty? But as we're all noting, there's the progress and there's the large unfinished task. So could I ask the panel now to think about and to talk about what you regard as some of the most critical next steps our nation needs to take if we are to become a country that meets Marian's vision, a country where every child has the care and support it needs and no child is left behind.
I think one of the things that has gotten in the way, and I agree with you, we're going to have another bite at the expanded child tax credit, and the other care programs for caring children, adults. A lot of what gets in the way is mythology. And it's mythology that has been shown to be false by research that's been done. And the question is, why has that research not changed as many minds as we need to change if we're going to make the kind of progress you're talking about? This unfounded fear that families who receive funds would spend, as part of a new floor for children, would spend these funds irresponsibly, that family supports would reduce the labor force participation. It's been shown not to be true. The large numbers of ordinary Americans that are skeptical of programs that provide cash and other forms of care without conditions is a big impediment that we have to get out of the way, not just with the research that needs to be done, but the research that reaches people. And it's a long-standing thing in this country. Some of you who may remember the war on poverty will recall that President Johnson was adamantly opposed to making payments to poor people. It was programs, not cash, that he said would end poverty. He told Bill Moyers, his closest aide, "You tell Shriver no doles." He instructed economist Lester Thoreau to remove from the economic report of the president anything that could be construed as putting cash in the hands of poor people. That line of thinking that preferred behavioral solutions over economic supports was a good fit with the popular sentiment that a significant part of the problem that needed fixing lay in the behavior of minorities. Recent research has found that the states with the highest proportions of African Americans in their population were less likely to allocate welfare funds to the provision of cash assistance and more likely to allocate these funds toward efforts to encourage the formation of two-parent families and to reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies. Although the belief that no one should get something for nothing has been a matter of long standing, Senator Joe Manchin has certainly done a lot to give it new life. There is evidence to the contrary, but nevertheless, he advocated making work a condition of funding, even though the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has found that these design features tend to be influenced by racism and sexism and account for an inadequate system of support that particularly harms Black families and other families of color. We used to think that we lacked the evidence to support the powerful steps that would radically cut child poverty. Now that we have the evidence, advocates following Marian Wright Edelman's model have to use it to dispel the myths that interfere with action.
Agreed completely. And I think broadly we should find a path forward toward some meaningful income guarantee. The enhanced child tax credit seems like as great of as promising of a path as possible. I think we need to separately not just rely on cash and people buying things in the market, but separately ensure a meaningful childcare system, national paid family medical leave program. I do want to call some attention to the fact that we also have millions of children and families, either without lawful status or in mixed status families, even people with lawful status who have to wait sometimes 5 years for access to benefits. And I think that has to be part, giving people a path to citizenship who are here, and supporting those families has to be a part of how we leave no child behind. And I will just note that there is a lot of evidence now that in addition to the fact that people's views on race, and as political scientists call it, racial resentment, are highly correlated, probably causally correlated with their views on supporting the sorts of policies and programs we're talking about. We've increasingly seen that people's views on immigrants are as or even more correlated with people's willingness to support these programs. So there's racism, there's xenophobia. And two other things I just want to touch on. One is, I think we have to find a way to further decouple school financing with housing and land values, and more generally push back on the racial and economic neighborhood segregation. We can talk about how to do that. And I think we've got to reduce pollution and the racial disparities and exposure to toxins. The research in recent years documenting the magnitudes of these effects, of these harms on children, on their development, on their well-being, is disturbing. Maybe not surprising, but quite disturbing. So if we are to leave No Child Behind, I think there has to be an environmental justice component to that effort.
I mean, ditto. Can I just like check every, you know, I think just all of the above. I mean, a few things I would maybe emphasize, although not much to add. I mean, I would, obviously, the child tax credit. I think a deep investment in early care and education, and truly universalizing access to early care and education for a range of reasons, one of which, of course, is the overwhelming evidence of the long-term impact, not so much in educational outcomes exactly, but in life outcomes, multi-generational deep impacts that we know early care and education provide, and making that truly accessible to all Americans. We know in New York, again, I keep coming back to New York because it's what I know best, most families can't afford childcare even if it were available, but it's also not available. There's 1 seat for every 5 infants available for childcare in New York right now, and neighborhoods where it's entirely inaccessible. And you were talking about the workforce. I mean, part of that is because of our disturbing lack of respect for this workforce, which I think is not unrelated to the fact that it's a female workforce, and at least in New York, a Black and Latino workforce. You know, the Post did an editorial a couple days ago which noted this ridiculous stat from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that childcare workers get paid, I think it was 59 cents less per hour than dog walkers. And if there's any stat that would sort of describe what's wrong with us, it'd be pretty hard to find one better than that. So expanding childcare, think about education. You talked about segregation, but just more broadly, our education system has always failed Black children, and it's always failed Latina children, always failed Asian American children, always failed low-income children. And part of that is around school financing and resources. Part of that is around, I mean, a lot of decoupling has to happen, just a fundamental segregation of our system, improving access to quality outcomes. So a deep reform of our educational system. I think about housing. So many of these challenges, of course, are grounded fundamentally in housing, and the fact that opportunity is so deeply connected in so many ways to where you live, and the increasing body of evidence that demonstrates that in so many different ways. Again, New York, we have 130,000 children who live in public housing and live in NYCHA in New York City. The federal disinvestment in public housing is a scandal that is not on the front page every day for reasons that I don't understand. We have 100,000 children in our public school system who are homeless or in temporary housing. So thinking about our housing and how do we build affordable, equitable, desegregated housing so that people live in communities of opportunity where they're connected to resources. Think about transportation, how transportation access and the lack thereof exacerbates these problems. Transportation policy has so often been a tool of white supremacy in our country, by destroying Black and Latino communities, by separating communities of color from opportunity, by subsidizing white wealth while destroying Black wealth. Looking at our transportation infrastructure and the opportunity, the requirement we have to reinvest in our transportation infrastructure as an opportunity to drive change. So look at the long list, and I guess that what I would, just to step back for a second, is to go back to, I think, what your leadership has meant to this country. We have to sort of think about what a successful economy means differently. We have to define it differently. Right now, we think about it as the Dow Jones and are we above 30,000? We need to redefine what economic success means for our country. And as long as children are living separated from opportunity, separated from education, separated from full and true citizenship, fighting that fight then creates a pathway to get at all the things that you just described.
You know, virtually everyone on the panel has mentioned the child tax credit. Lee, I just wanted to follow up on something you said. I've just in the last couple of months been looking at research based on what happened in 2021.
Yeah.
And, you know, people, as you said, people argued, oh, if you give cash to children in families with no earnings, the parents will use it to buy more alcohol, drugs, et cetera. Well, we have evidence on what people spent the expanded child credit on, and they did not spend it for increased expenditures for things of that sort. The biggest argument, as you noted, was people will work less. There are something like 4 major studies now out based on the data of what happened in the last 6 months of 2021, and every single one of them finds no adverse effect on employment. And there is evidence that a non-trivial share of low-income families that received that child credit used a portion of it for child care costs, actually enabling more of them to work and helping people reduce barriers to work. Just last night, I got an email with new data, new analysis from the Tax Policy Center, and they estimate that in 2022, there will be 19 million children under the age of 17, 19 million children under 17 who get no child credit at all or only a partial credit for the sole reason that their families either don't have earnings or the earnings are too low. That 19 million doesn't include, Indy, what you referred to, the additional children who are ineligible for the child credit because they don't have a Social Security number. That 19 million, the Tax Policy Center says 28% of all children under 17 in the United States get no credit or a partial credit because of low family income. And it's close to half of Black and Latino children, and close to 70% of children in families headed by a single female parent. So clearly, this is a really important area for the future, which leads to the final question as we're getting low on time for the panel. To realize the vision Marian has set forth for all of us, I think this follows from what you've all said. We're going to need, among other things, more research that persuades more policymakers and members of the public, but we're also going to need to move and create political will. So could I ask each of you to talk about what you see as being needed on either the research front, the political will front, or both, some of what will be needed in the months and years ahead to get us much closer to the vision that Marian, over the past 50 or 60 years, has set out for us in our country.
I think one of the themes that I've heard running through all our discussion is the connection between research and action. And I only learned in the corridor before coming in here that this organization, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, has actually been pushing for research in the public interest for all of its life. And I think that is to translate this wealth of research that we now have, that we've all been alluding to, into something that will persuade more people. You know, when Jason DePearl's writing about child poverty dominated 3 successive front pages of the New York Times, we all wondered, how did that happen? And he said that he was able to build on the work of researchers and analysts and advocates, because they were integrating what had been previously isolated pieces of research to allow others, including journalists, to arrive at coherent and actionable answers to big questions. And I think the more researchers keep in mind all the ways that their research can in fact be translated into language and ideas that will persuade a larger public, the better off we will be. In closing, I just want to say that it's very hard to celebrate these days amid the general unease that surrounds us. And only at the last session that the Academy held earlier today, I heard Theda Skocpol say, if you think this is bad, it's going to get worse. Well, I hate to think that she's true. I mean, she's a very reputable social scientist. We can't toss her off the way I would like to on this point only. But we can recognize the value of Marian Edelman's vision when she says that we have an opportunity to create the spiritual and political will to end poverty and racism and to raise high the torch of freedom and justice in a world desperately hungering for hope and peace. I think inspired by Marian's work, we can conclude that her vision is not an impossible dream, that it is a realistic objective, both on the research front and the political front, that all of us who care about America's future can be working toward every day.
That was so beautiful. I almost feel I feel like we should end on that note. Thank you for that. That was beautiful and helpful. I think the premise of this conversation, the premise of the Children's Defense Fund, the premise of your life's work is that, of course, research matters, that evidence matters, that data matters, and that we owe it to our fellow Americans to understand what works and to fight like hell to make sure that as much of that as possible drives public policy. All I would sort of say, and maybe a bad thing to say in an organization of researchers, I would also encourage us to have a healthy understanding of the limitations of research. Because if being right were the thing, it'd be a different world. We wouldn't be having a conversation about the child tax credit if what mattered was evidence about the impact of the child tax credit. We have seen in the last couple of years that this country is remarkably impervious to information and facts and data. We're talking about the senator from West Virginia. Data doesn't, data does not seem to be compelling. And so that doesn't mean that we don't have to drive and improve our understanding of what actually works in this existential fight. It is only a recognition that evidence and research uncoupled from political power is ultimately a fool's errand. But that's also the lesson of the Children's Defense Fund, right? Because the Children's Defense Fund is not a research entity only. The Children's Defense Fund is all about research in the service of action and political action. So, and I say all that, but not, for me, it's not to be pessimistic. I actually, I think pessimism is a worthless point. We all suffer from it because we're human beings, but fundamentally it's a worthless and counterproductive enterprise. Pessimism is not going to get you out of bed in the morning. It's not going to get you to go back to Senator Manchin's office and fight it. Pessimism is worthless. It is optimism. It is hope that fuels our action. And again, when I think about the history of this world. When you think about what we as a country have overcome, and we started the conversation talking about Marian Wright Edelman being the first. We are sitting in the room with the first black woman who was admitted to the bar of Mississippi. Like you can't look at the history of this country and be pessimistic. I don't understand how you do that. It would ignore the facts of progress in our country. It is insulting to the people who frankly fought much more effective foes than we have to fight. We ain't got to fight Bull Connor. We ain't got to fight so I would say, even acknowledging the limitation and the challenge ahead of us, and again, our country's real incredible power to ignore what is true and what is right and to do the opposite in ways that clearly break all of our hearts on a daily basis. I am nonetheless have nothing but optimism about the future ahead of us. And your life and your example are reason alone to embrace that optimism.
I should have let you end with optimism, but I will say that our democracy is slipping between our fingers, and we need to not just protect it, but we need to push hard to expand it. And I mean that in the obvious ways, but not also in the obvious ways. I mean, you think about some of the programs of the Great Society, and there was pushback. Richard Daley didn't like some of the community action agencies, as we know. But there was an effort around Head Start, community action agencies, and elsewhere that engaged people in their communities, in the programs. I know we at CLASP are proud to engage people from impacted communities in policymaking. We focus a lot on ensuring youth voice, legislative, administrative levels. We should think about, at least in local elections, if there should be lowering of voting ages. We should think about at least having the research that would help us draw what are the implications of things like giving parents a proxy vote for kids. I'm not endorsing these ideas, but the research can often be at the front line in helping us explore. That's empirical research. It's also theoretical work, right? And I think that this can help us understand the possibilities and help motivate some of the political will that I think we need to make significant reforms. I don't think that the worst is behind us, unfortunately. But with every crisis, we have a choice in how we respond. And hopefully, there will be a whole of civil society effort, including research, including politicians at all levels, trying to not just defend, but strengthen our democracy. And I will just note that there's a huge difference in the demographics by race of those, say, 16 to 25, and those, say, 65 and older. So I think in many ways, expanding our democracy is also, while an uphill battle, our most promising path to advancing racial equity.
Thanks, Indy. And this brings the panel to a close. On behalf of the panel members, I would like to thank the American Academy of Political and Social Science for giving us the honor of talking about Marian's contributions, Marian's legacy, and Marian's vision that continues and will continue to inspire us and so many others as we continue to try to all work on these issues in the years ahead. Thank you.
That was great.
That was really great.
Let me now turn it back to Marta Tienda for the remainder of the program.
Thank you so much for your inspired words. We could have been here all day, but we did try to put some bounds on it, even though you have been boundless in your efforts on behalf of children. So thank you so very much. I want to thank all the panelists on behalf of our board and to Bob so much for actually orchestrating this and thinking through how we can best find some common themes that give us food for thought going forward, because we must carry on. We must continue this mission on building on a very big shoulders. I have one of the things that I have is my responsibility. I'm asked to write a president's corner 3 times a year. And my very first one was last fall, and it coincided with the announcement that Marian would receive the prize for her work on behalf of children and fighting child poverty and all of its deleterious consequences. So I started to do some homework to think about what has happened in social policy during this period, and I looked and wrote about what happened with poverty more generally in this country, with the legacy of the Johnson administration when we launched the War on Poverty and all the various programs that were launched as part of that. And there's been an evolution in social policy over this time, but one of the things that I have found very striking as a result of that, when we passed Medicare to protect seniors, and that's a very large part of the budget, and Social Security, that in the prior administration with FDR, that was very unpopular when it was passed. And it's not in the Constitution. They are not fundamental rights. Schooling in this country is not a fundamental right either. We have 50 social contracts for schooling in this country. But for seniors, Medicare and Social Security operate like fundamental rights. Try, as many administrations have, to suggest that we're going to cut Social Security or cut Medicare. Keep the government out of my life, but don't mess with my Medicare check or my Social Security. And so seniors do have a powerful advocate in AARP with ample resources to lobby and advocate on behalf of their growing constituency as the U.S. population ages. And there's no comparable organization for youth except for what the Children's Defense Fund has seeded. But for children, we have organizations that are separate, and they work sometimes together, sometimes independently. It doesn't add up to the same kind of force that AARP. Have you been to the building? It occupies a whole block. And you mention this, and they are organized to make sure that you will not cut into seniors' benefits. Look at the share of the total federal budget that over time, the Urban Institute documents what share goes to Medicare and Social Security, and children's share of the federal budget continues to drop. So the closing part of my first director's president's blog but Marian Wright Edelman, the 2022 recipient of the Moynihan Prize, has laid the foundation for amplifying the voices to advocate on behalf of children. It is my hope that her powerful voice will inspire not only more research and annals volumes dedicated to children and youth, but also collaborations across research organizations and philanthropic organizations dedicated to improving economic opportunities for children and youth. Young people today are coming of age in an aging society, and it is absolutely critical to ensure that they share in the economic opportunities enjoyed by boomers and all of their predecessors. So I think we all are on this charge. Some of us are on the boomer age. We have a responsibility to foster the next generation. And Marian, with the legacy that you have laid and the guardrails that you have put in place, I think we have a very strong foundation to build on. But we've learned that we have some formidable bumps in the road ahead, and we will continue to prevail. We must prevail. So I want to thank Tom Katchkamethi, And Jessica, she couldn't be here today because you know there's some bugs flying around that get people sick, and their team for organizing this event. There's so much work behind the scenes, but our staff is really small. That's the staff. And so I want to thank all of you for coming today to recognize and appreciate the work that Marian has set forth, but she's left us an agenda. This is not an end, it's a continuation of an agenda that has already been marching along and that we have to continue to invigorate. And I'd like to remind you all that we're going to have a celebration, further celebration, by having a reception outside today here at the hotel that begins shortly. And it is up the stairs, down this hall, up the stairs and to the left, and it is outside. So I want to thank you all very much for participating, and Marian, congratulations, and thank you for the great work that you've honored us with. We have our marching orders. Thank you.